With both safe havens and slave auctions, the Mid-Atlantic region of the United States contained a series of life and death contradictions along the Underground Railroad.
Here, freedom seekers could find total freedom.
In Virginia and North Carolina, a seemingly uninhabitable swamp became a sanctuary for freedom seekers and a crucial stop for those heading north toward Canada.
This swamp really holds its secrets well.
In Maryland, trenches built by George Washington a century earlier were transformed into life-saving tunnels for those on the run to freedom.
There were places these churches had within their structures that hid people.
And in Washington, D.C., members of the free black community here offered aid to those seeking liberty.
Right here.
While nearby, the city played host to the buying and selling of people unable to escape enslavement.
Most of us don't know that this is here, that it was part of the Underground Railroad.
The history of American slavery isn't confined to southern plantations.
It's really a story that has yet to be told.
It lies beneath our feet, from the Mid-Atlantic to the Midwest, into Mexico and Canada.
The Underground Railroad is really a story about people who made sacrifices to provide assistance to freedom seekers.
And now, cutting-edge technology reveals secret pathways and shelters.
It's very unusual to find evidence. Nobody wanted to write it down.
And sheds new light on courageous freedom seekers as they risk their lives in the ultimate pursuit of liberty.
I have been able to piece together stuff that most people don't know.
As enslaved people plotted their course north to freedom, many either began their journey in or traveled through the Mid-Atlantic region. Here, below the Mason-Dixon line, slavery was the law of the land. But some men and women chose to stay in this area, finding sanctuary far from any line on a map. A thirst for liberty produced the resilience to thrive here in the most inhospitable environment imaginable. A mysterious area of Virginia and North Carolina known as the Great Dismal Swamp.
Between the insects, the venomous snakes, the bears, and all kinds of other animals that will kill you, it was a very, very difficult place to survive.
Any misstep in this watery wasteland could mean certain death. So how did thousands of enslaved people arrive and survive here? The secrets are in the depths of the swamp, which, despite its dangers, still offered a better life than one of enslavement.
Many did so from fear of being sold or separated from their family.
No concern about your humanity, no concern or care about your family, you are ripped out of your familiar surroundings and sold off to who knows where.
One account of life in the swamp came from a formerly enslaved man named Charles, who escaped to the swamp when he learned he was going to be sold away from his wife, saying, "Slavery asunders everything we love in this life."
How they were being treated, they preferred the swamp versus that living condition.
For those like Charles who could make it to the Great Dismal Swamp, it was the start of a new life. Archaeologist Dr. Dan Sayers has studied the Great Dismal Swamp extensively and is hunting down evidence of what life was like for people like Charles living in the swamp.
Here, freedom seekers could find total freedom. Geoarchaeology in the Dismal Swamp presented a lot of challenges, but if you look close enough, as I have in some places, right, they're there.
In Charles's account of the swamp, he spoke of areas deep in its interior covered in leaves that made a natural bed where they built homes and raised families.
So here we are coming up on an island. As you can see, coming out of the water, suddenly, like a natural miracle, we have dry ground.
These areas, barely visible to the naked eye, are now being confirmed with modern technology, LiDAR and groundwater model imaging, revealing tiny variances in ground elevation above the waterline, creating reefs and islands of land in the swamp covered with leaves, just as Charles had reported 200 years earlier.
And this is the exact kind of place that people who came out to this swamp trying to live would have looked for because of this dryness. And what they would have been looking for on an island is a spot just like this, flat and pretty much perfect for just that little bit of difference of elevation makes all the difference in the world right here on the dry ground. And on this dry ground, you could build the cabin, you could build the family and the community that you wanted, grow the food you needed. And this is where our search for those communities begins.
Freedom seekers also took advantage of relics abandoned by previous inhabitants of the swamp who had moved on, and adapted those tools for a whole new purpose that helped guarantee their survival.
What they're doing is saying, right, I don't need an arrowhead. I need a scraping tool. So now they're working that stone tool down, right? The original arrowhead now gets reshaped by a maroon living in 1720. And all those little flakes of stone are flying on the ground right here.
These are the tiny clues that Dan follows on his search for how maroon communities survived in the swamp.
Here's something. Let's give it the sound test. Oh, it's something, all right. Yeah, that's a stone flake. That's an artifact. So this would have been one of those byproducts of someone making a tool, most likely.
They tell a massive tale about how enslaved people built their lives in the swamp after coming here on the Underground Railroad.
It's the hallmark of these communities, tiny artifact archaeological signature. And it reflects this self-reliance, this coming out to the swamp and saying, I'm done with the world outside. I'm not gonna rely on the merchant and the market. What I'm gonna do is do what I can with what I have out here. And wood, plants, trees, everything else, plus the ancient stone tools and ceramics. They used it down to almost nothing.
Dan's research reveals that freedom seekers built clusters of log cabins and decks on stilts that kept them a meter above the swamp waterline. Between the homes, they added fire pits and a community garden. He suspects that they also cultivated rice fields, but any shelter would be useless without access to fresh water.
They are, in fact, surrounded, right, by potable or drinkable water. They could use it not only for drinking, but also for cooking and everything else that they might need water for, like we do.
The juniper gum and cypress trees here leach tannic acids into the surrounding swamp that make it impossible for bacteria to grow, creating water so pure it was once thought to have magical medicinal powers.
They had this seemingly murky brown water, but it's fresh.
They may have learned about the water's purity from indigenous people already living in the swamp in the early 1600s. Faced with British colonial invasion, some indigenous people from the Nottoway and Nansemond tribes strategically retreated here from their nearby lands. They were later joined by Africans escaping slavery from colonial Virginia.
We should also note as well that indigenous people were also enslaved, and as a result of that, sometimes enslaved Africans and indigenous folks would actually run away together and establish cohabiting communities.
But once at the swamp, runaways weren't forgotten by those from whom they had escaped. Across 2 centuries, enslavers used bounties and created special laws to protect the wealth created by enslaved people.
By the 1850s, slavery was a massive system that involved the banking industry, the insurance industry, it involved the textile, it involved the maritime industry, and so slavery was valued more than all of America's industries combined.
But those now living inside the swamp were protected by the natural environment surrounding them.
So when it comes to white folks, white people in the outside world who would chase after people who ran away, what they found in the swamp was a very harrowing place. This place is the super thick undergrowth, and you can't take horses in, you can't go in on boats, you gotta walk it. And you gotta know where you're going.
Others were overwhelmed by the Great Dismal Swamp's sheer size. Today, it spans about 500 square kilometers in Virginia and North Carolina, nearly 2/3 the size of New York City. But in the 1800s, it was over 5,000 square kilometers, an area bigger than the Grand Canyon. Factor in its sizable population of armed, elusive settlers, and pursuit was effectively impossible.
You can go in, but you're in no position of power here. You're at a loss for the landscape, and even if you can navigate that, you got to deal with the people once you find them, and they're not going to come out happily. In fact, they're probably going to just kill you.
The community of Maroons, a term derived from the Spanish word for cattle, cimarron, which compared runaways to livestock, grew in the swamp, and so too did the greed of enslavers who came up with a new plan. Beginning in the 1790s, enslaved people toiled for over a decade to build a canal through the swamp, creating what would become a lucrative waterway for transporting goods.
I've estimated that it's probably one of the largest earth-moving operations in human history.
But the canal would evolve from a money-making enterprise for enslavers to a key passageway for freedom seekers on the Underground Railroad. For over 2 centuries, the Great Dismal Swamp was a refuge for freedom seekers.
Literally thousands of individuals who were formerly enslaved were able to flee to these settlements in the swamps of Virginia.
Archaeological evidence is revealing that the people living in these massive hostile marshlands of Virginia and North Carolina were part of a thriving community.
They didn't just eke out a living. They weren't living out here fearfully. They came out here and they became really part of the swamp itself.
The flora was so intense. It created its own microclimate. So you had little pockets, and people would settle in these little pockets, and they reproduced. So you had generations of people living inside the swamp.
As the community of self-emancipated people deep inside the swamp continued to thrive, groups of enslaved men were brought to the edge of the swamp and forced to dig a canal. Its purpose? Large-scale logging and the transport of goods between the North and the South. The treatment of these captive laborers was brutal.
The day-to-day torture, an almost demon-like atmosphere that enslaved people had to endure, hand-digging that canal.
Over a span of 12 years, while standing waist-deep in mud and water, they cut their way through the swamp, building a canal that was over 35 kilometers long. Over 800,000 cubic meters of dirt and undergrowth was pulled from the swamp, enough to fill 75,000 modern-day dump trucks. An unknown number of enslaved people died along the way.
And their bones are still in this swamp.
When the Dismal Swamp Canal opened in 1805, some who survived its construction and other enslaved people were put to work on it, including Eric Shepherd's ancestor, Moses Grandy.
He was a waterman on the Dismal Swamp Canal, moving lumber from the Great Dismal Swamp down into the Norfolk area.
According to oral history, it wasn't long before those enslaved watermen started smuggling freedom seekers down the canal.
You had the transporters, which we believe was Moses Grandy and others who were captains of the boat on the canal that moved wood or lumber up and down the canal, but probably individuals as well. The waterways were Underground Railroad hub of activity for people to get to free states.
By hiding people under piles of lumber and making secret runs in the canal, enslaved men like Moses Grandy and others relied on every network they had to deliver freedom seekers into the key port city of Norfolk, Virginia.
He could navigate between those 3 worlds, including the Maroon community, the enslaved community on the swamp, as well as the enslaved community on the plantations.
The risk was huge for these highly skilled captains, but Moses Grandy and other watermen could also earn money by transporting freedom seekers.
It was an economy around enslaving people. There was also an economy around freeing people. Who was supplying the funding for them to move people? Some church groups, some philanthropists that were helping doing the right thing at the right time for the right cause.
In the end, Moses Grandy was able to buy himself free. As a child, he'd seen his family torn apart, but as a man, he was able to reunite with his wife, 2 sons, and grandchildren by purchasing their freedom and bringing them north. But without the sacrifices of the enslaved men who built the canal, none of it would have been possible.
Maybe combining the whole story and putting it together will set the example for how we can heal as a country, heal as a nation, and heal in humanity to make things right.
320 kilometers north, the nation's capital of Washington, D.C. and nearby Maryland were home to numerous networks of the Underground Railroad. The latter was the birthplace of its most prominent conductor, Araminta Ross, or Minty, who was born into slavery in 1822 and grew up in the woods and wetlands of Dorchester County. She later took her mother's first name and her first husband's last name, becoming, as we know her, Harriet Tubman.
Harriet Tubman works outside and alone. She has a very important understanding of the land, the landscape, direction, geography. She can negotiate the land.
Harriet Tubman led over 70 people to freedom through the wooded areas of the northeastern United States from 1850 to 1860. Archaeologist Julie Shablitsky thinks the survival skills to do it were learned here in Maryland at the home of Tubman's father, Ben Ross.
This is a place where Harriet Tubman was born, on this property somewhere. Sometimes we wonder, is it the spot right here at Ben Ross's cabin? It could be.
Harriet was a child of enslaved parents who were forced to live apart from each other. As a child, Tubman lived with her mother, Harriet Green, and as a teenager, moved in with her father, Ben Ross, working with him and being hired out for jobs in the area, including the timber forests and docks near Chesapeake Bay.
Ben Ross, because he worked in the timbered area here, he would have taught her how to navigate through those wooded areas, how to navigate through swamps and wetlands, what it would have been like, how to live off, if you will, the fat of the land. And all those sorts of skills helped Harriet Tubman become the hero she is today.
Yet proving this was Tubman's home in her younger years is taking continued investigative work. Julie discovered the deed showing this location was owned by the same man who held Tubman's father in bondage.
It's on a piece of property that was over 1,000 acres owned by Anthony Thompson.
Julie also found Thompson's will, freeing Ben Ross after Thompson's death in 1836, which granted Ross the use of a cabin and 4 hectares of land. But his wife, Harriet Ritt Green, remained in bondage.
Ben Ross had 9 children. He was married here. We know that Ritt, her mother, worked in the household where the person who enslaved her, Anthony Thompson, lived.
Money made from the land willed to Ross allowed him to eventually buy his wife's freedom, but his children remained enslaved. 3 were sold south, and Harriet escaped enslavement in 1849. Then, in 1854, Tubman would lead all but one of her remaining siblings to freedom. Julie Shablitsky believes the skills Tubman learned here are what made these escapes possible. But the paper trail alone doesn't confirm this was the home of Tubman's father, so Julie is searching for artifacts which she thinks will prove that the Ross' home once stood here.
We don't know the exact size, but we do know it was made of wood. This is a metal fastener, probably a cut nail, and it would have fastened lumber together, nails, bricks, and of course things like window glass. So it's undeniable that we do have a home because it has all sorts of artifacts associated with them living here.
But one item carries special significance for Julie.
We have Lady Liberty, ironically found while searching for a place of an enslaved person. And you can see that it also says 1808, which is an important year because it's a year that Ben Ross and Ritt Green were married, and they're the parents of Harriet Tubman.
It may have also served as a beacon of hope for Harriet's parents, because Tubman's father also secretly assisted people to freedom.
But initially, they didn't suspect Ben because Ben was trusted by the white community. So how could he ever be involved in this? But he was.
Ben Ross was implicated in a famous 1857 group escape of 2 women and 6 men, most of whom made it to Canada.
So when he was under suspicion in the 1850s, he decided to flee with Harriet using the Underground Railroad.
In 1857, Tubman guided her parents to safety in Ontario, Canada, one of her final rescue missions. And now, through the discovery of artifacts that helped tie Harriet Tubman and her father to this land, the secret history of the Underground Railroad's greatest hero is becoming much clearer. But not everyone escaping Maryland had a skilled guide like Harriet Tubman by their side. As changes in the economy made enslaved life even worse, freedom seekers found others willing to help and developed their own inventive ways of evading recapture. In the 17th and 18th centuries, slavery was defined by the bondage of Africans forced across the Atlantic Ocean, and the epicenter of North American slavery was found on the tobacco plantations of Virginia and Maryland.
The tobacco is the big crop, it's the big product of the United States. It's the big economic agricultural product. It's for export.
But by the early 19th century, the tobacco market collapsed and a new cash crop arose in the southern states: cotton.
There's an excess of labor with the decline of tobacco in Maryland and Virginia, and you have a shortage of labor where they're going to grow cotton in the South.
A new domestic slave economy based on the sale of African-American people from the mid-Atlantic into the deep South emerged on a scale so profound that use of the phrase "sold down the river," which described this trade in the 1800s, still today communicates a deep betrayal.
People who were bred for the Southern market became the new human cash crop.
In an audio interview from 1941 in the Library of Congress, Laura Smalley, who was enslaved as a child in Texas, recounted how some people would be selected to produce offspring for the financial benefit of their enslavers.
You know, just like a big fine-looking woman, a big fine-looking man, you know. Old boss wants, you know, children from them, you know. They just fasten them up in the house or somewhere, you know, going off and leave them in there. Want to breed them like those hogs or horses.
Something like 1 million people are sold to Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and Alabama to grow cotton.
Southern slave owners were known for being especially brutal.
Once you were there, your life expectancy was cut in half. Conditions were far worse.
As the export of enslaved people from Maryland and Virginia became more profitable than the export of tobacco in those states, one's chance of being sold south increased, pushing dreams of freedom to become actual plans for escape.
When you see them with the little bundle in the icon, that means I have planned, I have packed, I have some food, I have some ammunition, I may have a compass. That's what's happening. Over and over again, every time you see an escape ad, it's an admission that these people that you're holding in slavery are outthinking you. They got out, they left, and you couldn't stop that, and B, you can't find them.
Slaves hid in the woods, traveled across farmers' fields, made their way through thickets and swamps, anywhere that they could avoid human contact.
Historian Anthony Cohen is uncovering secrets used by freedom seekers to evade capture in the forests of Maryland. Anthony knows the routes of the Underground Railroad better than most, having walked hundreds of kilometers to retrace the steps of enslaved people who made the journey from Maryland to Canada.
I tried to figure out ways that I could tap into how freedom seekers felt on their journey.
From the moment they made their escape, freedom seekers became targets of hunters and their hounds.
Escaping slaves encountered many dangers, so they developed a number of methods to throw the dogs off of their tracks.
Self-emancipating people like John Warren smeared red peppers on his heels to block the animals from picking up on human scent. Octave Johnson lured pursuing dogs into a swamp and then watched as alligators devoured them. Both men were successful in their flights north, with Warren reaching Canada and Johnson joining the U.S. Army. Other freedom seekers running north simply spread their scent around to confuse the hounds.
Sometimes they would encounter slaves working in a field, and they'd run in and out, touching all of the people, and then running out the other side. When the dogs approached, the scent of the runner was on a half a dozen people or more, and it would cause the animal to stop, actually lay down, and cease the chase.
But if the dogs closed in, science became as important as speed.
If you reach a waterway, skin cells from your body will collect on the water and amass themselves along the shore. This provides an excellent way for the dogs to actually track you. If you can get into the center of the stream, the fast-moving water will prevent those cells from making it to the side of the bank.
Maryland history tells of close calls in places like what is known as the Spider Cave. Evidence suggests it's found in Simpsonville, nearly 50 kilometers north of Washington, D.C.
We have forested stream valley that looks similar to the way it did at the time. And we also have a free black settlement up the road.
In the story, two enslaved men being hunted were running through the woods looking for a place to hide. They came upon a small cave, its entrance covered in a large spider's web.
They had an idea, and that was to drop to their stomachs, shimmy underneath the web, and take shelter in the cave without breaking the threads. The hunting party arrives at the cave and they see the unbroken web. Assuming that their dogs have maybe tracked an animal, they turned and went away.
It might well have given people on the run a moment of refuge, saving them from recapture.
And as you can see now, there are spider webs even here today. So it's not unfathomable that a larger web spanning the entrance, just like in the story, could have happened.
But the key to the Underground Railroad was more than forests and hidden places. It was really all about people.
Rarely does a person make it from their point they leave to the point they end up without a lot of human intervention.
With one small-town pastor secretly aiding freedom seekers, ironically, by using a set of tunnels built by one of the nation's most famous enslavers, George Washington. Many of those fleeing slavery from the mid-Atlantic states traveled north to the Mason-Dixon line, the boundary between Pennsylvania and Maryland, which separated the free North from the slave South.
The northern border was the line that people were trying to get to, across which they were able to claim their freedom.
While slavery was legal until 1864 in Maryland, it wasn't embraced in every corner of the state.
Western Maryland was not a hotbed of slavery. Western Maryland was what we would call a society with slaves, not a slave society. The society's economy is not based on slavery. Western Maryland had a free black population going way back. These types of societies become critical in building a network of anti-slavery resistance throughout the state and throughout the country.
From Washington, D.C., freedom seekers followed the Potomac River along the Chesapeake and Ohio Canal through the Appalachian Mountains to the tiny town of Cumberland, just 6 kilometers south of the Mason-Dixon line. Hidden under a church here, it is said that a secret series of wartime trenches became a sanctuary for people headed to freedom.
This church became involved in the Underground Railroad shortly after it was built. It was opened in 1851, and it was built on the old tunnels that had been here since the time of the fort.
The wartime trenches now sitting beneath the church have been transformed into narrow tunnels stretching under the length of the structure. Once freedom seekers arrived at the outskirts of town, they would have to hide out and wait for a signal from the bell of the Emmanuel Episcopal Church.
In those days, they rang the bell every hour on the hour. That's how people told the time. But let's say at 3 o'clock on a very dark morning, maybe a stormy morning, the bell is going to be rung not 3 times, but 4 times.
That extra ring of the bell meant it was safe to proceed. Crossing Wills Creek, freedom seekers would make their way uphill to the tunnels that led into the basement of the church. Measuring 1.8 meters deep and stretching all the way down to the water's edge, these trenches were built 100 years earlier by the man who would become America's first president.
They were built under the supervision of a young 23-year-old George Washington.
From 1754 to 1763, Fort Cumberland was at the heart of Great Britain's war with France for control of their North American colonies. Fighting for the British, Colonel George Washington ordered his men to dig a series of trenches here.
These trenches were dug to give access to water and to raids of soldiers here, or whatever it might be.
Remarkably, over 250 years later, the trenches continued to stand firm due to the geological makeup of the materials used to build them. This included mud pulled from the Potomac River and the hills close by, with sandstone and limestone, which was poured into forms and made of wood and stacked.
You're not going to hurt them if you want to touch them, but you're going to get dirty because it's river mud.
What Washington didn't anticipate is that 100 years later, those same trenches, designed for a war of conquest, would become a covert passageway to liberation.
Architectural features are definitely a part of the Underground Railroad. If there's a tunnel for people to escape, it wasn't built for that purpose. It wasn't meant for that purpose, but it can be easily reused for that purpose.
According to church history, in the 1850s, Reverend Buell and parishioners would use these former trenches of war to provide freedom seekers with food, medical aid, and provisions.
And from that point on, it was only a 4-mile trek due north to the Mason-Dixon line and one more step toward freedom.
The tunnels themselves were no secret, and that might be why they worked so well.
One of the things that's really interesting is how they use the obvious, and they have to be inconspicuous. The obvious becomes very, very important.
Over 200 kilometers from Cumberland, the nation's capital, Washington, D.C., was home to intricate networks of the Underground Railroad. It was also a notorious base of slavery, in stark contrast to the familiar symbols of freedom that still stand today, many constructed with forced labor.
The enslaved black men who built the Capitol and the White House, they never saw a dime of that money. That money that they made for doing buildings that are still standing went to their owners.
Despite this, there was still hope in Washington as free and enslaved African Americans worked together to turn the Capitol into a major hub of the Underground Railroad. Known today for its celebrated monuments to liberty, at one time the economy of Washington, D.C. was driven by agriculture made possible by slavery. Topographical and geographic information system maps and overlay technology show how the urban centers started off as large open plots of land, which were used to grow tobacco, and enslaved labor made it possible.
The very economic foundation of the Capitol is based on human bondage. There was so much money to be made. The number of slave jails in D.C. exceeded the entire number of the state of Virginia. The purpose of the slave pens was to buy and sell enslaved individuals, usually a cash transaction. We're standing right now in front of the headquarters of the Federal Aviation Administration, but that wasn't always here. This is the location of one of D.C.'s most notorious slave pens, the Williams Yellow House.
For those on the block, the auctions were both tragic and humiliating, as told by Fountain Hughes, the grandson of a man enslaved by Thomas Jefferson and himself born into slavery.
Well, we were slaves. We belonged to people. They sell us, and they put you on an auction bench, bid on you, the same as you're bidding on cattle, you know. Maybe $200, $100, $500.
They might have been cajoled to dance or sing a song. People's ages were wiped away by greasing down their skin or plucking gray hairs from their head. This was particularly harrowing for women, who were often put on the block, forced to disrobe. They were inspected for scars, burn marks, anything that would indicate that they were trouble. Some showed their scars and openly talked about how they would fight anyone who tried to whip them.
In contrast to the slave pens and auctions, Washington was also a key hub of the Underground Railroad. These networks were established and run by free black men and women.
Let's first get it right. This was a primarily African-American affair. How would you react if you're considering the Underground Railroad and a white person showed up saying, I'm going to come and collect you and take you down to the D.C. waterfront? That's really not going to work that well.
Free blacks like Leonard Grimes, a Washington, D.C. pastor and abolitionist, were risking their lives to transport freedom seekers.
He owned his own cab, and so he began to shift people from slavery to freedom.
You have a thinking, thriving, proactive black community helping other black people out of slavery. This is dangerous.
All risk, every step of the way, was often borne by African-American abolitionists, dedicated groups of individuals. You almost had cells, and if you were careful about putting the word out, an ear of a conductor would be caught, and you might be approached, or you might be told to approach someone at the right time, at the right place. We know one conductor had his freedom seeker, a young lady, meet him in front of the White House. Now, ultimately, she's going to wind up in Canada. But can you imagine escaping from enslavement in Montgomery County, Maryland, and then making it all the way to Canada? That's the efficiency and the reach of the network of freedom once you got on it. Once you got on it. And you get a wonderful example of this in the narrative of Thomas Smallwood. He gathers people, he marshals them in, he arranges for the wagon. And I should also point his wife as well, because they both work together. He and his wife seem to have uncommon courage.
After several close calls, Thomas Smallwood escaped Washington himself, living the rest of his life in Toronto, where he continued to organize travel on the Underground Railroad. Regardless of status or involvement with the Underground Railroad, every black person in D.C. was at risk.
The slave codes had a section talking about free blacks because those codes were all about making sure that people understood that the freedoms of people of African descent were different than the freedoms of those who were white.
They are arrested on the streets of Washington and accused of being runaway slaves. You're locked up, you're advertised. If you're a free black, nobody's going to come and claim you. So what happens to you then? And in far too frequent an occurrence, you were then sold to pay the jail fees.
Leonard Grimes was caught and jailed 2 years for aiding freedom seekers. But abolitionists and freedom seekers didn't give up. Just 3 kilometers from the White House, black enslaved laborers building the Capitol lived in D.C.'s oldest neighborhood, Georgetown.
Most of the enslaved people did not live with their owners. Where did they live? Within those black communities. In fact, many of the free blacks and enslaved people were actually married.
By 1830, most African Americans were free who lived here. The people who were enslaved worked, worshipped, and lived together. So when you talk about the Underground Railroad and you talk about 2/3 of the people here that were free, they had a bit of the slight advantage to help those who were enslaved. And so it made it easier to strategize.
It was places like here, the Mount Zion and Female Union Band Cemetery, that the community could assist those traveling on the Underground Railroad.
Black churches around DC and in Georgetown would leave clothing here, food, knowing that people were here. William Still, an abolitionist, wrote about people coming through the Georgetown Cemetery, hiding behind the monuments.
When we're thinking of concealed spaces in the history of the Underground Railroad, we're lucky enough to have one right here, and that is the burial vault at Mount Zion Cemetery. It would be here that freedom seekers might hide for several days, or perhaps, if they're unlucky, weeks. And among the urns and coffins, they would risk everything for freedom. Can you imagine spending a day, a night, or longer in here, in a space that may not exceed 10 feet square? It is a tangible symbol of some of the discomforts that our ancestors were willing to endure in order to secure freedom.
These days, there's a different battle going on in Georgetown.
So in many cases, African-American burial sites are intentionally or unintentionally erased over time.
We're right beside the white-only cemetery, and you can see the difference in care, a cemetery that was established 50 years after we were here. It was given government appropriations. They were able to create their own engineering underwater storm management system. The city didn't do any stormwater management, so we get sucked into all the land erosion. The irony is, in this neighborhood, a lot of those who were enslaved came from George Washington's plantation. Some of those enslaved people are buried here.
Now, though, archaeologists are working to honor the people buried here, using technology to locate their lost graves and revive this forgotten history. This cemetery serves as a memorial for those who sought refuge on its ground and those who lived and died here.
People are buried everywhere, on this hill and down in the ravine.
Many of those graves that gave freedom seekers a place to hide have been forgotten or lost. LiDAR imagery of the site reveals deteriorating topography that could destroy hundreds of undiscovered remains and artifacts. So Lisa Fager is working to restore the cemetery and is teaming up with archaeological investigators and students in an effort to uncover and record monuments lost to time. Together, they are searching the cemetery using high-tech gear, including ground-penetrating radar to discover what is in the soil beneath.
Here, we're going to use this to look for graves and unmarked locations where people were buried.
At Mount Zion, the soil there is very conductive, which means that the GPR data is absorbed more readily than in a less conductive environment. So this actually thrives in that sort of environment. It's good in conductive soils. We can see more deeply, but it is something that is better suited to a conductive environment such as Mount Zion. So we are looking for graves. So this data logger tells us where in the grid each line of data is.
Archaeology can find foundations and say, what is this doing here? It's called historical archaeology. And so we need the historical record.
So far, they've uncovered enough tombstones and decorative artifacts to locate more than 100 lost graves.
I think that we're on the right track to kind of uncovering a lot of this history, especially as it relates to Mount Zion Cemetery and this park that we're sitting on. I definitely think we're moving in the right direction.
There's far more work to be done to identify the remains and understand how these people fit into the broader history of the Underground Railroad.
The fallen headstones are like chronicles in stone of America and the contributions of enslaved and free Americans to the community, to the state, to the city, and to the country at large.
For Lisa, this work is crucial to protect the history of the Black community, to remember those who passed through on the road to freedom, and to honor those who assisted them.
I think about all these lost stories. So many people are in here. I do not want to go to my death leaving this place the same way as it is now.
For somebody working to uncover the secrets of the Underground Railroad, the struggles of freedom seekers are more relevant than ever.
The Underground Railroad, which is a golden chapter in the history of human endeavor, reminds us that black people were courageous, black people were smart, and that there were occasions when bold white folk who recognized with us that injustice needs to be dealt with, and they were willing to risk their lives to work along.
To me, the legacy is really about ingenuity, it's about creativity, it's about resilience. It's really about all of the powerful things that you have to bring to bear to get yourself out of slavery. And what a wonderful model for any of us to rely on, to get ourselves out of whatever we're facing today in the world.